Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, the podcast where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversations. Fascinating thing about intersections is that we all come to many intersections daily, and the way we navigate these determines the trajectory of our day and our life. I'm Dr. Philip Brown with my good friend, Dr. Terry Jackson. We have an outstanding episode for you today, the self-work experiment.
The self-work experiment. That's interesting, especially in the age of technology. Because in the age of technology, we often go to these devices to look up information that we think we're learning, but we're not. We're really regurgitating, right? And so that brings into mind, how are we actually thinking? What are we thinking? And what is the role of thinking in learning, in the self-work that we do?
It makes me think of a saying, I think you're the first one I ever heard say it. You talk about the knowing-doing gap, right? And so if we've done the self-work and if we really know, then we should be able to execute on something.
Right.
But sometimes there's a gap.
That's right. Because we know what needs to be done. We don't know how to do it. And that's part of the challenge in this highly technical society. We were talking earlier about AI, artificial intelligence, for those who don't know, and ChatGPT, and its impact and the potential impact that it can have in the self-work that we do. Because at the root of all self-work has to be learning.
Absolutely. And we're inundated with a bunch of different stimuli all the time.
Yep.
Right? And a lot of it is sensationalized. A lot of it is entitled a certain way to get your attention, but that really doesn't represent what lies beneath, if you will. And so we've ended up with this extremely superficial level of understanding, and we see that propagate into so many misunderstandings.
We can go all the way back to a term phrased in one of the political administrations around fake news, right? Because that's a bunch of stories that have been told and layered upon without anyone doing any real research to get to the root of what it is, right? You tell enough people and they regurgitate it to others, and all of a sudden everybody believes it. And then when you go do the research, you find out that's not true. But people begin to tell the lie and begin to believe the lie, right? So at the root of self-work has to be learning and truth.
Fascinating thing about the whole fake news concept, and we had a recent, very well-known guest, Dr. Srikumar Rao, who I could see developing a story that everything is fake news. Right?
Yes.
It's stories that we have told ourselves based on our reality. My reality is going to be different than your reality. Even if they're close, they're not going to be the same, and on and on and on. It's all just models that we stack.
Yes.
One on top of the other that make it easy for us to navigate our lives. That's not a bad thing, except to the extent that we fail to recognize that it's just a construct.
Yes.
And my reality and your reality aren't always the same. And if there ends up being conflict, then there's a reciprocal obligation to understand the other person's reality a little better.
Yeah, that's right. And that's something that I heard from you as it relates to, I understand my reality. I have somewhat of an understanding of your reality, but because mine is different than yours, then I have to be able to incorporate some of yours in mine to really get the understanding, right? And that's true. That's true learning, right? I learn about you, you learn about me, and then, guess what? There's another way that we've learned that neither one of us held. And so, in my development, when I think about, I'm going to use a phrase, seminal work. Right. Seminal work is when you do on the research and you get to the bedrock of whatever that topic is. You've come to either what they would call the mother of that topic or the father of that topic, who really laid the foundation upon what it is you're studying, right? As we have the father of medicine, we have the father of history, the father of management being Peter Drucker. basically they lay down the foundation for what that particular area of expertise is. And I've always been taught, especially through going through the doctorate process, I want to go to the seminal work. And once I get to the bedrock, then I can look at all the other work around it. It's like Dr. Rao. He studied all the masters, right? Stripped it of all of its religious dogma and just gave us the principles for what these masters lived by, which is so simple, but not easy. And so we have to, as we look at the age in which we live with technology, and when we talk about AI and Chat GPT and these other technological devices, the question is, are we really learning anything? Are we developing any of that seminal work, or are we just being dumbed down by this information and these devices?
Yeah, it's what's new, right? Like the great masters from way back, whether they be the philosophers, the principles in any of the major religions or anything, when we do that process of distilling down now, it's remarkable in my mind how often it gets all the way back to those roots. And so, you can certainly make an argument, I think, that there's nothing new in this earth, right?
Right.
I mean, it's
That's
all,
right. That's right.
it's
That's right.
all recycled, and it may be shined up to have a modern application, but without the understanding of the bedrock principles, man, what does that mean? And I think there are quite likely implications for artificial intelligence in that realm that we've not contemplated yet.
Yeah. Without knowing, when you're doing this self-work, right, without knowing the bedrock of the information, it's easy to spin the story, right? We see different news reports out of Florida and what they're doing with history, and Texas has done some of the same kinds of things. But you can't spin the story when you get to the truth of what it is, right? You only spin the story because there's some fear and there's the control. And even though we talk about control being illusional, as Dr. Rao would say, control doesn't exist. There's a group of people who think that they do have the control and they can control what history is taught, right? But at the very root, they're not thinking about the self-work that comes along with learning, and the injustice it's going to do to those who come after they've created and implemented their agenda.
Well, I think, the more I think about it, and this is just kind of coming to me now, so it'll probably be sloppy sounding, but spin is almost the antithesis of self-work, right? Because spin is a story that you're telling to convey a certain point. So you're not trying to understand better at all at that point, right? Like you're trying to sell. We're all in sales to a certain extent, and the spin is all about selling a point of view, right, rather than understanding something at a deeper level.
I couldn't agree with you more. And whatever I'm selling is in my interest. It's not in the best interest of everybody, but that's why I spun it, because I wanted it to come across a particular way. As I like to say, control the narrative. There's a narrative that's being controlled there by the spin that's not in the best interest of all and probably has very little to do with the truth.
I think this is from Dr. Rao too, but I'm pretty sure that he says that no human is capable of acting outside their perceived self-interest at the time. And you say, well, what about these acts of altruism and all of that? But if you distill it down, if you peel that onion back, that person at the time had a perception that what they were doing was right for them at that time and was in their best interest. And when you start thinking about that, to me, it actually makes everything easier, right? Because what it says is, I shouldn't ever expect too much of anybody because they cannot act outside of what their best interest is. So to me, that is a stimulus to say, where might we find a mutual self-interest, right? Because if we're having an interaction, and I have foundationally, I now believe that you're incapable of doing anything but acting in your self-interest, same as I am, then it's gonna drive me to figure out where the mutuality is.
That's right. How can we co-create a new reality together, right? That's basically what we're talking about. We have an interest. I'm understanding that I can't act outside of my interest. So how can we co-create an interest in which it's a part of you and it's a part of me? And it gets back to self-work, right? I often wonder about technology, what we're actually learning as a people. We were going through some conversation earlier, and I said, hey, there's students out there who are taking math classes, and the math is all on the computer, where you punch in the numbers and it spits out the answer. And the question is, from a self-work perspective, and we are seeing this in some restaurants, as we go in, and those who can't calculate without a calculator and have to do it in their heads, who can't make the calculations because they're so dependent on the calculator or their phone or the register, the computer, to do the calculation for them, that it's really hindering us.
It's true, and it's interesting, right? So you always play multiple sides of those models, and so you get into the what how difference pretty quickly, right? Like, and one of the things I think our show has highlighted, we've had multiple guests who talked a lot about how you do something, whether it's Aisha Barcel, how you design the long life you love, or Sally Helgeson, how you create inclusion, or Dr. Rao, how you do this self-work, or many, right on down the list. That how is critical, and there's some sort of fundamental things that it makes a lot of sense to just be able to carry with you, have at your disposal, and it's interesting. In my career as an executive, I kept meticulous notes because I tended to remember things better that way. But on a day-to-day basis, those notes themselves weren't helpful. It was the process of creating them that enabled the knowledge to dwell within me so that I could carry it around with me and make it portable and act on those ways. And then, you come back and you sort of, you write down how it went. You're like, okay, what can I learn from this? And then you iterate. So it really is a fundamental process, right? You take these things out. And the self-work experiment to me is, how do I take what I think I now know, put it into practice, and then validate what's happening, right? How am I applying all this energy into a process, and then going back and figuring out if the process is valid, does it need modification, does it need more experimentation, or what?
Right. On an episode we had Dr. Tom Morris, he talked about practice. And that's what I just heard. How do you practice the process so that you will know what it is you think you know? And I think earlier I saw you actually write down the word repetition, right? And when you were writing that, I said rhythm and ritual, because a process is really about rhythm, ritual, and repetition. You keep practicing it over and over. It's just like learning, self-work. We keep working on ourselves on certain areas all the time. It becomes a ritual. It becomes a practice, right? And so we know the information we think we know, and we continue to expand on it to add on to our foundation or our base of knowledge. But we always continue to improve upon that base of knowledge in our self-work as well.
It kind of reminds me, takes me all the way back to my undergrad days and working with the UNCW basketball team. And there was a coach, Cletus Green, and I remember his, he had this combination of repetition and fundamentals. He said, as a coach of any kind or a teacher, you're obligated to always teach fundamentals. So then the way you teach them is through repetition. And he had a saying, and so you got to tell them what you told them, tell them what you told them, and then repeat. And creating these repetitive patterns, first of thought and then of, an action-based execution of a skill. And, life is really no different. And when you look at the greats in anything, how fundamentally they are in many different areas. We always use Michael Jordan as an example of a great. And, what people forget is how fundamental he was. He wasn't Defensive Player of the Year all those years just based on his athletic ability. It was the fact that he practiced fundamentals. His hand was always in the passing lane. He was always in the right defensive stance. And yes, he had great athleticism that allowed him to make up for certain times where he got out of position. But over time, his relentless dedication to the fundamentals meant that he was less out of position than the next best guy. And so it just, it built and built and built. And we can do the same thing with the course of our days and lives.
That's right. We all remember going through elementary school and learning our timetables and how we had to continue to recite them 1 times 1 and 1 times 2 over a period of time up through probably maybe 3rd or the 4th grade. We had to continue to recite them. And that speaks to the ritual. It speaks to the practice. It speaks to the whole process of learning the fundamentals of mathematics, and that in and of itself made us who we are. Now today it's a little bit different. They're not probably teaching it the same way, so we have to kind of figure out. And I got this out of the Cracking the Code book that I'd mentioned to you. In what ways can we marry the fundamentals with technology in order to optimize the learning process or the self-work process?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, sports analogy again, right? Is that you're obligated to learn how to shoot a layup correctly before you learn all the different derivatives of what that is, right? And it's through the repetition of doing that you develop basket awareness, court awareness, that you know where you are, that you develop basically instinct and intuition of what position your body's in, so that if you get fouled in the process, I need to put a little bit extra on this one, or I need to take a little bit off of this one, and it gives you a better chance to succeed. The fundamentals of self-work are really the same thing, right? Because it's the story that we tell ourselves always, and we're constantly talking a story in our head. Right. Dr. Rao's thing about mental chatter and mental models, and that's not new. That's from the ancients.
That's right.
How do we fundamentally check ourselves on some of these things that we're doing? That the stories that we tell are going to be told constantly. Checking ourselves on the fundamentals is making sure that we're spending the most time on fundamentals that we value, right? Yes. That the stories we are telling ourselves about ourselves and about what's happening are consistent with our values, are consistent with what we think is important, or maybe what we aspire to.
That's right. And with the episode we had with Dr. Rao, he mentioned the flashlight. Shining the flashlight on those things that are of importance to us. Often we shine them on the negative things, but let's shine them on the positive things. As you were talking about the fundamentals of self-work and sports, and how you learn to shoot the layups first. Once they advance and they begin to shoot jump shots and shots off the glass, coming down the court at certain angles, they're really doing geometry in their head, because with the jump shot and with off the glass, there's an angle involved. There's a trajectory that's involved, right? But you hear the same guys say, I hate mathematics. Because the story that they've been told, I've been telling themselves that they're not good at mathematics. But now I can show you on the basketball court how you're very good at mathematics, and you're doing it automatically in your head. So let's deconstruct that model that you're not good because you're doing it now. Let me show you how to do what you're doing on the court on paper. Because you're already, your brain is processing it mathematically as you shoot the jump shot, as you take the angle. Even in football, as you run a route and you go down, you run a post or you run a flag route, right? There are angles involved with that. You make cuts. It's all mathematics. So let's rewrite the story and figure out what ways we can help you understand it on paper, just like you understand it on the court or on the field.
Yeah, it's physics, right? Like
That's right.
You know, mother physics.
That's right.
All those laws. You know, gravity's going to be gravity, and all these things. We can translate so many of these things into the experiment of self work, and to me, it's really just fascinating that a lot of times if we get the dialogue out of our head and write it down, our understanding goes up. And the same thing holds true for these fundamentals. I remember, you know, the professors that I had, and I had a bunch of professors to get all the way to the MD. You know, some of the ones who were the most gifted were the ones that made you want to practice for some reason, right? Like, and they presented things in such a way that it made you want to practice, and it was through that repetition. I remember especially one of the courses, sort of like it's a weed out course, you know, is organic chemistry. And I had a professor so good, he's still around town, you know, connect with him from time to time, Dr. Syed. He made you want to learn that, and you would go and you would sit there and you would learn how to do those problems through repetition. And at some certain point, the light just came on, and then it became intuitive. You could substitute any of those problems, and the principles just were part of me at that point. And so you could plug anything into there, and I could use those principles to solve the problem. And, you know, that's what when we say self-work and we say practice fundamentals, that's what we're advocating, right? You can't just know it in your head. That's insufficient. It has to be part of you.
That's right. And you have to be able to execute against it. I got to be able to show you, because the best way for one to know that they know the information is to be able to teach it or be able to show another person or a group of people how to do it, right? And, you know, there's so much mental chatter that conditions us, that given our self-work, at the root of it is knowing how to think, right? Not what to think, but knowing how to think. And I often say that as I went through school, for the most part, let's say high school through the master's program, I wasn't taught how to think. I was taught how to regurgitate information. It was only when I went to the doctorate program that I was taught to think, because then I was creating in my dissertation chapters 4 and 5, which was my original research. Chapters 1 and 3 was somebody else's research. I'm building up to why this study is important. And then in 4 and 5, I'm going to speak to why my research is important, right? And then you give that to the world. But other than that, in the educational system, and there'll be some teachers, I'm sure, that will contradict this, but we're not teaching people to think. So it's tough to do self-work if you don't know how to think, because then you're thinking like as others want you to think, and your self-work is not your self-work. Your self-work is someone else's work.
And that's how we get all our mental models, right? Like,
That's right.
Our mental models get built from the time we're born, you know, of what's good and bad, what we're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And, you know, and we put our own individual little twists on those as we grow and develop. And at some point, you have to be able to at least ask yourself what you're telling yourself, right? Like, why does this make sense? How does this make sense? What if I thought differently?
Yeah. Basketball player used to play with the Knicks many, many years ago in the 70s, Bill Bradley, who became a politician. He said one of the things that he did and how he assessed doing business with people is if he took them to dinner and he watched them. If they added salt or pepper to their food before tasting it, he didn't want to do business with them, because what he equated that to was people making decisions without information. It was very interesting. They made a decision that the food wasn't going to taste a particular way or was going to taste a particular way and needed an addition to it without even having tasted it. So they make quick decisions, and he didn't want to do business with people that way. And so we all probably know people, and I know some people in my life who are like, well, I don't like that kind of food. I said, well, you don't like it? No. Have you ever had it before? No. Well, how do you know that you don't like it if you never tasted it? That's because in our environments, we've been conditioned a certain way. We've created these mental models and this mental chatter about what is or what isn't without having evidence of such. And that's important. So self-work is about building the foundation so you have the fundamentals so you can go back to evidence one way or the other, or you know how to go get the evidence to prove one way or the other.
The self-work challenge, I think a lot of times, is really a humility challenge. To really begin to do the work that you need to do, you have to be humble enough to admit that you need work.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. That's right.
It's not, you and I aren't getting along, it's your fault.
Right,
Well,
right.
We might share that, actually, but there's almost certainly a component of it that I own and have to. But the self-work is actually that process of continually asking oneself, what do I need to do differently? What is behind this? And then also challenging yourself to more deeply understand where a thought is coming from. And it takes you to peeling back the onion in a lot of ways that sometimes that's, it may not be very comfortable, right? It may take us to experiences that we just soon forget.
I would agree. You just made me think of this Hawaiian, I guess it's methodology that they use, and I want to make sure that I'm pronouncing it correctly. I think it's Ho'oponopono. And in that particular practice, when something happens, you never place the blame, but you ask yourself, how was I responsible for that happening? What was my responsibility or accountability in something happening that was either good or not so good? If there was even if there was a car accident that I had nothing to do with, and I was passing by it, what kind of responsibility do I take for that? Right? That's kind of the mindset that they have, that everything that's around you, there's some responsibility or accountability that you have for it, good or bad. But that's deep self-work, right? That we get into because we realize that I'm a work in progress. Here are things I need to work on. I've shined the flashlight, and here's what the flashlight has shown me. And so I need to do this work, and it only happens through humility, because you have to be able to shed the concept of who you think you are to really get to who you are.
There's such a component of grace that needs to be associated with that as well, right? Not grace for other people, grace for yourself, because one of the traps is guilt. And a powerful model that is worth employing, I think, and has been for me, is I just need to forgive myself immediately, because my previous self that did that thing didn't know what I know now,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So,
right.
you know, I can be responsible to do better going forward. But in the past, I didn't have what I needed, the right tools, the knowledge, the understanding to have acted any different, right? I was acting with what I thought was the best way in my perceived self-interest at the time,
Right.
right?
Right.
And
Right.
and now I'm a different person today than I was last year or yesterday or 5 minutes ago.
And as our friend Dr. Rao would say, I can't change what happened and I can't change who I was, but what I can do is I can change the story that I tell myself about who I was. Because now I know, given the data and the information that I have today, that I would have made a better decision. And so, in having to do so, I can't change the outcome, because we never really control outcomes anyway. But I can, the story, it goes to somewhat of the alternate reality construct that he has, right? Of, how we walk through the world on a day-to-day basis, how we see ourselves, and which is probably an illusion. And then you create this alternate reality around what you really would like to be, who you really would like to become, or what you would really like to do, and then look for the evidence of that being able to occur.
I'm always fascinated by his description of us as pure awareness, and I think about having learned about negotiation long ago. The whole go to the balcony metaphor, where basically you're outside of yourself. You're able to look down on the situation and see what's happening and have better judgment about it. The whole philosophy he prescribes basically is to do that with yourself all the time, right? You are the awareness of what you're doing, but only to the extent you can be aware of it, and hence all the exercises, but you are aware of a series of different roles you're playing. Right now, you and I are podcasters. In a little bit, I'm going to go home and be a husband and, a father. I've had all these roles that shift along the way. And the role of that, of just being aware of that and being able to look at it, is what actually gives you a chance to do the self-work, because you can say, I played this role the best I could then. When I have a chance to play it again or something similar, these are the changes I think would be beneficial.
And as you and I both know, with this self-work, there comes a lot of self-assessment and a lot of reading to become aware and to stay and try our best to stay aware of how we're moving, because who I am today, I doubt very seriously that I'm going to be that person tomorrow. So what do I need to learn and to understand to continue to evolve as a human being, right? And to evolve in the different roles that we play throughout the day, whether it's a son, whether it's a father, whether it's a husband, whether it's a business person. And that's the whole cycle of perpetual learning, right? That constant self-work. And for those who are in the business world, that's the importance of having an executive coach or a business coach or a mentor, someone who can help you stay along the lines of that self-work that is needed to continue to evolve into who you want to become, in the future. So self-work is important to any and every human being that exists on this earth.
And the concept of next play is so powerful. And there's lots of sports analogies in that regard, right? Like you saw last night happened to be Super Bowl, right? And so Jalen Hurts fumbles and they run it back for a touchdown. Well, the next series he comes out and several long runs anyway, a touchdown, right? Like, he didn't stay mired in the fact that he had fumbled and cost him a touchdown and an extra point. He went to the next play. He executed on the fundamentals impeccably and took him into the end zone. And that's really, I think that's the analogy that we need to carry forward into life. Something happens, didn't work out like I wanted it to. I'm going to learn from that, but I'm going to immediately move and act, put into practice what I just learned, right? I'm not going to carry a bunch of extra guilt because I didn't know any better or didn't do any better, but I am going to be responsible to do differently the next time through a new model I create, perhaps.
That's right. And at the very root of that, and the Jalen Hurts example, is consider all of the self-work that he had to put in his career of being a quarterback, from being I'm going to say toddler to a teenager to a college quarterback, and to now having played in the Super Bowl. Because remember, when he was drafted, there were many who never thought that he would turn out to be the type of quarterback that he's evolved into. And that is the self-work. He believed in himself. He didn't listen to what the naysayers were saying. He put in the self-work in the offseason, during the season. He gained the trust of his team. And over a period of time, he's become successful, even though they may have lost on the scoreboard. Everything that he did has been all about winning, to even include the adversity that he faced at Alabama as a quarterback when he won the national championship, and then, of course, he gets benched about a year or so later. But he graduated in 3 years from Alabama, and when he went to Oklahoma, he earned a master's. And so one of the questions I was asking about Jalen Hurts, I said, well, how many Super Bowl quarterbacks ever played the quarterback and held a master's degree? So he's proven at every level, from an academic perspective and from a sports perspective, that he's put in a lot of self-work to excel in all that he's done. And if anybody's going to be an example, he should be an example of how you can be a winner at it all.
Yeah. And his example is so great because it didn't work out like he thought, right?
Right.
He's going to Alabama to be a starting quarterback on multiple championship level teams, and all of a sudden he wasn't. And that clearly is something that he took as motivation. And that motivation is very clearly still driving his practice and performance and his habits that are making him what he is today and what he's going to be tomorrow. And to me, that's just a fantastic representation of growth.
Absolute. And being aware enough, as we've talked about awareness, to understand how I have to improve my skill set to become one of the best quarterbacks in the game. Not only that, but I had to have some pretty good study habits along the line to earn my degree in 3 years at the University of Alabama, and then to earn a master's degree in human relations at the University of Oklahoma. There had to be some very good study habits in there too. And so all of that is applicable, whether it's sports, whether it's academics. The practice, the process, the repetition, the ritual, it applied to both academics as well as to athletics.
And it always makes me think, right, like, so what if we were able to scale this philosophy, right? Like, what does it take to apply this type of philosophy of doing the self-work? And in leadership, the theory now is back to, it's pretty much all self-work anyway, right? But everybody seems to acknowledge that. but there's still a knowing doing gap.
That's right. That's right.
You know, what closes that thing, right? What model?
That's right. You know, and yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to go way out on a limb, and I'm going to say that even though leadership knows in their mind they're thinking change, when they should be thinking transformation, they should be looking at the model of the caterpillar to the butterfly, because the butterfly is not a better caterpillar. It's a totally different entity. And so as you're going through this evolution, at some point in time, you go from evolution to revolution. And that's meaning the examination of mental models, the deconstructing and the reconstructing of new mental models that fit who you want to be, who you want to become, understanding that you're never going to go back here. But our comfort zones keep us here. And until you become comfortable being uncomfortable, you can't really, in my mind, in my opinion, go through a true transformation, which means you're going to go back to what's comfortable. So you're going to change for a period of time and you're going to resort right back. That's when we talk about change initiatives with 72% of all those in corporate America failing. That's the reason. Because the mindset, which is what you have to address first, the mental models and the mental chatter, that comes at the very beginning of the transformational period. And I think that's what the difference actually is.
Yeah, you kind of got a lot of caterpillars that, you know, want to be butterflies, and quite a few that think they're butterflies, but not enough willing to go in that cocoon and do the work that's needed to become a butterfly. And, you know, it's kind of the whole, I think Stephen M.R. Covey talks about it in his book, Trust and Inspire Leadership. You have a lot of what are considered enlightened command and control leaders, right? Like they think they're trust and inspire type leaders, but they're not. They haven't actually done all the work to get there. And so, you know, the self-work that hasn't happened ends up demonstrating them in the eyes of their workforce to be counterfeit. And we wonder why there's such a huge flux in workforce, no matter what industry right now, right? Like the workforce is a moving target, right? And there's no stability in many different industries. And I think it has a lot to do with that, right? Is that, you know, folks are believing themselves to be the type of leaders they want to be instead of going through the process of transforming themselves into the kind of leaders they want to be. I know I've done it at times, right? There are definitely times where, you know, I've thought my behavior represented one thing, and, you know, you get the feedback and you realize, no, it only represented that to me. Everybody else, it was something different.
Right. That's the power of that whole 360 assessment, right? You get the chance to see what people really think about you and your self-work. Even from a coaching perspective, when you have the stakeholders who are observing you and observing your behaviors and giving feedback, there's a great deal of power, because even though you may think you're doing the self-work to make the necessary adjustments, they're sitting back and they're saying, okay, well, yes, and maybe no, right? And so we all have to have, and I like how you put it, our own personal board of directors, right? Who are going to tell us what we need to hear, but we may not want to hear it, right? That's what true friendship is about, and that really plays a major role in self-work.
Yeah, and it's another one of those things that you can't really close the knowing doing gap until you've done enough fundamental repetition to have a feel for it, right? Like it has to really be much more about who you actually are than what you do.
Yeah.
And then you develop that sense over time. And, you know, we've seen incredible examples of it, you know, with Dr. Rao saying that, you know, this is just, my model's just a model. If you want to pick it apart,
yeah,
you will.
Right. That's
I mean,
right.
you know,
that's right.
but try it on and see.
That's right.
You have Gary Ridge come on here and say, well, I'm incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah,
This guy who's
right.
done led all this and created this wonderful culture. He
Yeah,
says,
yeah.
he's consciously incompetent, right? It means what he's really saying is, I have a lot left to learn and a lot left to grow that I know I'm going to do the work, right?
Yes.
He's putting it right out there and saying, I'm going to do the work. I am going to be that person, that future me that I want to be, because I'm not scared to say I'm not that right now.
That's right. That's right. And for those who don't have the confidence to do that self-work, oftentimes it's the person who is doing the self-work that's being observed that inspires that person who doesn't think they have what it takes to do the self-work. So we have to be mindful of who's observing us as well as real leaders, because we're going to inspire someone else to do the work, because they're going to notice the change in you, or the transformation in you, I should say, as it relates to putting in the self-work and seeing what the outcomes are, even though it's not outcome driven. It's really about the process and the journey and the learnings that happen along the way of putting in the self-work.
On that pragmatic level, it's, you become the 5 people you spend the most time with, right?
right.
So be
That's
careful, right?
That's
That iron sharpens iron metaphor,
That's
however you want to say it, right? Is that you tend to gravitate toward the mean. So, be careful what that looks like for you.
Yeah.
And the same thing holds true in, this is not just about, a bunch of high-powered executives hanging out, or a bunch of, superstar athletes hanging out. It's about, if you want to have a broad perspective, you better hang out with a crowd of broad-thinking people.
Yes.
With a lot of different temperaments, talents, and convictions. So it really has to do with understanding what you value, how you would like to see yourself grow, and then creating that environment through the stories you're telling yourself to get to a different place, to a transformed location.
I remember someone told me one time, says, small people remain small because they think small. They think small because they remain small. So a lot of it is how you think. I often ask the question, how many 65 or 70-year-old men did you ever hear talking about still having a dream? At some point in time, it's shut down for lots of reasons. Some of it's because they don't see the importance of doing self-work on a continuous basis.
Stuff gets trained into us. We become what we're immersed in.
That's right.
And basically, to a certain extent in our society, and this could be an episode by itself, when you kind of reach a certain age, you begin to be discounted. That's to the detriment of not only the individual, but to the collective.
Yes.
Something that we've got to figure out how to solve, especially important as you and I get closer and closer to that.
Right.
Just saying.
Yeah. That's right.
But the truth of it is that, at every stage, people have something to offer the collective. A wisdom, a set of experiences, a level of understanding that can be shared, and that richness gets created that way. And you see some of the highly successful cultures, places where people live very old, into the how many centenarians. One of the things is that the culture values those people for who they are. And we need to do a better job of that. I think it would help close some of these gaps that we talked about, right? These gaps of the difference between what I can cognitively contemplate versus what I can be. Because the folks, as they get older, there's a comfortable in your own skin phenomenon that happens.
That's right. I think I saw an African proverb that says, when an elder dies, a library dies as well. And that's because when you talk about wisdom, whereas in this country, we don't value getting older. We see it as a liability, whereas in other cultures, they see it as an asset, because all of this wisdom that rest with this particular person. I can sit at their feet and just learn. Tell you an interesting story. I remember trying to learn a little bit more about my family and my lineage and who do I need to go to and talk to in my family as to who was the historian. And at this time, this is before my grandmother passed, and she passed in '09. I was telling some friends, I said, man, I need to go learn more about my family. I need to figure out who I need to go talk to, right? And so all of a sudden we have this family reunion, and my grandmother is sitting there in the middle, and everybody is talking to my grandmother about the family's history. And I came back and I said, wow. Man, all this time I've been trying to find who in my family I can talk to about my family history and the historian. And the entire time I'm around my grandmother's house every day, and it was my grandmother, and I didn't know, only because I didn't ask. Had I asked her, I would have gotten all of that information much sooner than going to a family reunion and seeing everybody sitting around talking to my grandmother. And I was like, my grandmother was the one. Yeah. And I didn't realize because I simply didn't ask. And it probably had something to do with her being older and some kind of value that I can't tell you what that value was, but some kind of value that I placed upon her or that I didn't place upon her because I didn't think about her as being the one who knew all of the family history. And that taught me a powerful lesson.
Yeah, isn't that something?
Yeah.
Right, hidden in plain sight,
hidden
right?
in plain
like
sight.
A diamond right there on the kitchen table.
And I'm there with this person every day, only because Grandma was cooking hot meals every day. So, but I didn't think to ask her about the family's history, and she was the one. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, man, this has been a great episode. I want to thank our listeners for sticking with us again as we each were doing our self-work as we went along in our own self-interest, so to speak. But if you want to catch us, we hope you will go to unlikelyintersection.com, see all the episodes. We've had quite a few recent guests that are outstanding episodes as well. You can find me on LinkedIn at Doc Philip Brown. You can also find me at docphilipbrown.com. And Terry?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Terry Jackson, PhD. You can find me on Facebook. And may I also say, please go to our website, like, comment, request topics you may want to hear. And if you would be interested in a duo coming out to your organization to speak on a multitude of topics, we're also available for that as well.
See you at the next intersection.